Hello, everyone, and welcome to an on-demand presentation here at the 2022 Joint IT and Software Cost Forum. Our speaker for this presentation is Doug Howarth, the CEO of Hypernomics. The title of today's presentation is Using Hidden Dimensions to Solve Unseen Problems. We would greatly appreciate it if you, our viewers, could stick around all the way until the end to answer the survey about the format of this presentation. This is the first year we're testing out these on-demand sessions, and your feedback on them would be greatly appreciated. Without further ado, I will turn the stage over to Doug to get started.
Jonathan, thank you so much for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I met Jonathan at a International Cost Estimating Analyst Association meeting in Pittsburgh back in May, and kind of like what we were talking about. So this led to this invitation here to the DHS. And the title of today's presentation might sound like we're trying to reinvent physics, but what we're doing instead is we're discovering mathematical dimensions that we're going to use to solve some problems you haven't seen before. So let me give you a brief overview where we're going to go. Broadly, what we're going to do is we're going to zero in on a problem that the government has right now, go into that in some depth. Then we're going to step back and look at the overview of the process and then see how the process drives itself into different environments, and then we're going to answer questions about how it works in the real world. So a little background about what this is going to do, and then we're going to talk about a government initiative we call Prompt Global Strike. And then we're going to look at some starting places that we have for that, the U.S. bases forward that are in other countries. And then we're going to talk about what we can afford. That's a big driving factor in hypernomics. You want to be able to figure out what your limits are and what people want. Generally, we're going to do that for missiles, and then we're going to go to aircraft. So we're going to look at air-to-surface missiles, and we're going to look at the planes that carry them. And then we're going to talk about the process and some applications, and then eventually answer some questions at the end. So with that in mind, let's dig into it here. As I'm sure everybody at the DHS knows, that the original DHS problem came from 9/11, and there's part of your mission statement right there. And as most of you probably know, just a few months after 9/11, we've managed to corner Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora. Our goal was to capture or kill him, and he slipped away. And he slipped away because we had a delayed advance. And the government recognized this, and they said, well, if we had a prompt response, if we were a little bit more timely in what it is that we did, perhaps we could have resolved this war sooner. And so the government decided that the Prompt Global Strike initiative will become a priority. So there's a need for speed, which is known as Prompt Global Strike. So the requirement at the beginning was that the government wanted to be able to reach out and touch bad guys anywhere in the world inside of an hour. And they put a lot of money into hypersonic research recently, as you can see here. And the problem, as it surfaced initially, was that a lot of people in some service branches said, well, let's just shoot these missiles out of submarines or shoot them off of ICBM ports. And the problem with doing that is if the missile isn't an ICBM but looks like an ICBM, it can be confused for an ICBM, and that might elicit some unwanted responses, like starting World War III. We didn't want to do that. So what came from the community in general was that they said, well, we need to launch these kind of projectiles from the air, and they need to be air-to-surface missiles. And since we want to get there in a hurry, and since their competition is using hypersonics, we're going to want to use hypersonics. And so right now, the U.S. has one hypersonic weapon that it's testing right here, that at least that they've noted, the Lockheed Martin AGM-183. And the observation you can make out of this is that it's got a very short range. Its range is 1,000 miles. And if you want to reach out and touch anybody on the planet, well, you're probably going to have a bunch of these missiles forward based on planes that can launch quickly and then get the target accounted for in a prompt fashion. So the good news, as it applies to America, is that we've got lots of bases overseas. And a lot of these would be able to support the Prompt Global Strike Initiative. And that turns out to be really important for this analysis. So what I've seen happen in my tenure in aerospace, and this goes back on over 40 years, is that sometimes people would say, well, let's suppose that we lose our bases abroad. And then they come up with some program that has these fantastic range attributes and these fantastic repeatability abilities and things like that. And the problem is that when you suppose that you don't have your forward bases, now you have to make things that are going to be quite a bit more robust from the United States. And it turns out, as we'll see, there's simply not enough money in the world for you to be able to do it that way. And this is what drove this analysis in the first place. So this analysis, part of this, the missile and the aircraft bit, was originally given to the Royal Aeronautical Society several years ago. Then I gave it to NASA. And then I gave it to the International Council of the Aeronautical Sciences. And it's been revised yet again for this purpose. And then we've expanded it. So in order to figure out what you're going to be able to do with the missiles, you have to see what you have in the way of missiles. So this is a survey I did from a few years ago that shows all the smart bombs, also known as glide bombs, smart bombs, and the air-to-surface missiles that the U.S. had in their inventory that they claimed from this 20-year period here, beginning in 97 and ending in 2016. So you see you have glide bombs up here at the top, missiles down at the bottom. We have their quantities, their prices, and then we have these attributes here. So you might ask yourself, well, what could we do with a database like that? Well, let's take a look. What happens if we were just to dot map the quantities and the prices? Now, what do I mean by dot mapping? Well, the dot map in this vernacular means that we're going to plot in the horizontal direction the quantity of the bombs or missiles that we purchase. And vertically, we're going to plot the prices of those products here. So the glide bombs are in brown here, and the missiles are in blue. Notice this is in log space. And what's very interesting, and many of you are in the business of doing analytics here, and you'd say, hey, I'm starting to see some patterns emerge here. Specifically, you see that there's an outer boundary that's forming here along this outer edge. You see that? And if we mark these outer boundaries with yellow dots laid on top of these blue dots, and then we decide to run a regression through that, such as we see here, a power form equation, we see that we get a highly correlated curve. Now, when it says no bias, ladies and gentlemen, what we've done here is we've corrected for the downward bias that happens in an unadjusted curve by correcting it up using something known as the ping factor that comes from Shu Hu Peng, who was a longtime contributor to the ICEA community. Anyway, this is a very highly correlated equation that explains what happens to the market at the limit. So this is when we say frontier here, this means that nobody's getting very far beyond this frontier. And this is going to be a crucial concept for us moving forward. Now, it turns out in this particular market, there's an inner boundary too, and we can mark that with these white dots. And if you strike a line through that, you see you get another curve, which we could call minimum demand. So, very importantly, if you're going to take about one or two things away from this presentation, one of these ought to be this, is that calling for more product, in this case, air-to-surface missiles, calling for more product than the market will bear, again, going beyond this frontier, is going to meet budget resistance. So dot mapping also lets us calculate the responsiveness of price in another way, which is we start with the same data, and we can parse this data into bins by price. We can do it either in an evenly priced array or by Fibonacci series or geometric series. And what we're doing here, ladies and gentlemen, is we're going to work out the total quantities and average prices in each of these bins. So here we've got 4 lines, creates 5 bins. This is the total quantity in this bin and the average price. The total quantity in this bin, the average price, and so on. And when we draw a line through that, we get what's known as the aggregate market demand, which is a very important concept, which shows us the slope of the market has relative to how much revenue it's putting in. And if this slope, the coefficient here is greater than -1, and this one is, that means that there's more revenue, more money being spent at the lower end of the market than the upper side of the market. So let's verify that. Let's go off and do a histogram of the spending profile. And you see here, these are to the right, we have the very high priced missiles. And here we have the ones that are the next nearest bin. And then we have these missiles here. So there's a trend in this market to have more money going to the lower priced missiles and bombs. So on average, the government spent about $1 billion a year to do air to surface missile procurement. So what drives these prices? Now, a lot of you have heard of the law of supply and demand. We're going to look at something in a different way in just a bit here. But what would happen if we just dot map the features? In this case, the feature here is the momentum, the kilograms of the weapon times its speed. Kilograms, kilometers per hour gives us a momentum term, and we're going to plot the range here. And we've got the smart bombs here, and we've got the missiles here. And when we find the surfaces that best describe the data, we get a couple of surface here that come out of this equation here that says the price is a function of this constant times the range times this step function here that basically says if it's gravity powered, don't step it up, but if it's powered, take the power from 2 to the power of 3 or 8 times. This is 8x this, and then take it times the momentum term, and then of course you're carrying an air term here. And it works out that missiles are 8 times as expensive as the comparable smart bombs. And that's good to know if you're going to try to create budgets for these products here. Now, very interestingly, what you saw here just recently is we did a little 3D setup where we have on your left here, we have what's known as value space. Again, we have the momentum term as one horizontal axis, and we have the range term as another horizontal axis. We have price as a vertical axis. And then from a few slides ago, we were looking at demand, and demand had quantity as a horizontal axis and price as a vertical axis. And you say to yourself, well, look, these two entities share the currency axis. They are one and the same. And what this means is that there's certain ways in which we measure the value of things, and there are means that we have to fund it. You can consider this to be the Ways and Means Committee, formed by the buyers that buy these products, the Ways and Means Committee of the market. So these form a 4D non-negative system about a common axis. And what that means then is that there's an origin. Now, of course, this is in log space, but you can imagine there's a 0 point here, and you're going from 0 to this direction, which is range, which is positive, 0 in this direction, down the momentum line, and 0 in this direction, going up through price, and going 0 in this direction for quantity. So these produce ordered quads, these 4D systems. And so if we look at specific products in that market, shown here, we've got one bomb, the Blue 111, and a couple of missiles, the JASSM ER and the Slammer. And what this means is we're looking at their range. So, for example, if we start out with the Blue 111, here's the range. Goes 28 clicks. And so here's 10 to the 1. So there's 10 clicks. And here it is at 28 clicks. There's 10 to the 2. There's 100 clicks. It goes 28 kilometers. It's got this momentum term. So these two value attributes form the value of the product, which in turn determines the price, and then the price determines the quantity sold. Conversely, then, for the JASSM ER, it's got a range of 1,000 kilometers in this iteration. And it's got a momentum term here, and these two terms combine to form this point here, this value proposition here, which in turn determines the price, and the price determines the quantity sold. And the same thing happens then for the slammer. And so what we see then is that all products in all markets outside of commodities have these 4D systems. So you might ask yourself, well, what about the aircraft that carry these missiles? And so we want to consider the fighter bombers and attack aircraft and the UAVs that have carried these vehicles that the USG bought from 1957 to 2016. So it's a long period, and we need that long period in order to get the number of observations that we require up. So we've gone and created a big pool. All these vehicles were actually working at the time of this analysis in 2016. So if you dot map aircraft demand, you get this view. So we've seen how we can do aggregate demand here. We have a curve for that. We've already looked at a demand frontier. We've got a curve for that. And we've got this minimum demand here. We got a curve for that. And in this particular case, the UAVs, the unmanned air vehicles, this would be the Reaper and Predator B, I think. They haven't attained this minimum demand. They're in a different zone there. Now, very importantly here, this coefficient is much greater than -1. That means that there's more money spent on this market's low end than there is in the upper end. And we can see that as we do another histogram. And so this is even more pronounced. So these are all the vehicles that the government had that are greater than half a billion, which only consists of B2s at this point in time. And then you go down into the next bin, down from 200 million up to 500 million, you get this amount. And you can see that there's progressively more money being spent in the lower bins than in the upper bins. So the government spent quite a bit more money on the aircraft than it did for missiles and bombs. And that turns out to be stuff that we're going to want to know. So we can dot map value and demand for this market at the same time. So we're looking here at the aggregate market demand curve, and this is demand frontier. The blue points, the yellow points represent the points that hit the frontier. These are the other jets in the market, and these are the UAVs right here. And if we plot this, we find that we get a 4D system that describes value in terms of the constant, the range, the max speed in kilometers per hour, and then there's a quantity term that has a very steep coefficient on that. And this turns out to be useful for us here. So that means if we wanted to plot a surface, as we've done here, we have to set the surface to a certain quantity. So here's the surface set to 21, which is how many B2s we bought. Here's one set for 313, which matches this UAV. And here's one set to 5195, which matches the F4 from days of yore. And so these surfaces describe what the products are worth based on their speed, their range, and how many you bought. Basically, what this is saying is the more you buy, the less it's worth. The government pays quite a bit to get the initial capability, and then as they need more and more, the value to them falls off. This happens in virtually all markets. Only occasionally do we get a term that falls out of the analysis that actually suggests that you've got a quantity term in the value equation. And when you get a quantity term such as this is known as a product demand curve coefficient. We're going to see how that works here in just a second. So the implication of that steep curve is that here's the value equation. If we were to plug in the range, if we were to plug in the range again in the max speed and the quantity and then vary the quantities here. So we plug in the range and the speed into what the B2 had here. We get this unit value curve here. It's from equation 11 of a paper I gave some time ago. And then the USAF spent this amount on an average basis to get to get their 21 vehicles. They stopped here. And so what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's an average cost curve that we could regress backwards and then work out a unit cost curve going forwards. And when we do that, we discover that the value of the vehicle, as defined by the terms that the government used, the value of the vehicle for the B2 exceeded its cost at the beginning, which makes sense. We've assumed it's a 79% learning curve here. We don't know the exact curve that they had. And so value continued while production continued while value exceeded cost. So here, value exceeds cost, production keeps going on. But at this point here, value equaled cost. And then past that point, if you were to try to go any further, the cost would exceed the value. So what this means then, ladies and gentlemen, is there's a certain curve that you can derive. If you know your cost curve, you can derive your unit value curve. If they have slopes that intersect, you can figure out that intersection point and predict where your program is going to end. That turns out to be pretty helpful sometimes. So using this kind of analysis, you can find the limits for any new bombers that you would build. So the United States is now building something called the B-21. So the government wanted to buy as many as 100 units of the B-21 at $610 million in 2016 dollars, which would have been this term here. They want to buy 100 units, but the market only supports 100 units at $393 million, which is this point here, which creates this plane here in log space. Here, if you actually take the limit that the government thinks they have, which is $610 million in 2016 dollars, you see that the market only supports 42 vehicles. And so if we take the two curves that we saw from before, where we put in the quantity term, you'll see you get a flat plane again in log space, and another flat plane in log space, one relating to the quantity of 100, the other to a quantity of 42. And when you intersect one of these planes with this other plane, what you get in linear space is our production possibility curves. So again, the government thinks they can get 100 units at $610 million. They're going to get 42, and here are the possibilities for them if you consider only speed and range. There's no consideration of payload or stealthiness here. But you see, what's very interesting here is that the government can get a very capable plane, one that could go halfway around the planet and go just below Mach 1 for the price that they're showing here. Again, there would be more considerations of payload or stealthiness, but the point here is that there's a highly capable platform that you can get for this price, that you can get your full complement of aircraft that you're not going to get at this price. So if you put your price here, you're not going to get this complement of aircraft. So you can get a great capacity here for a lot lower money, and that's what we want to be able to analyze. Again, so what will the air-to-surface market for missiles support? So here's our demand frontier. Recall we had this. Now we've driven this curve all the way back to its constant here at 1. Well, the United States, again, has this AGM-183. This is the Lockheed Martin hypersonic missile. And its price at Unit 1, adjusted back to 2016, actually exceeds this limit. And if the good people at Lockheed, I worked 30 years at Lockheed, the Skunk Works, if the good people at Lockheed were to build this vehicle and experience the same demand curve that they're having for the F-35, well, by the time they get to 100 units, they might work the price down to 13.8, which looks pretty good compared to this. But recall this demand frontier that we have here. Well, what does that have to say about what we're going to be able to do? Well, let's take a look. So at 100 units, if you just do the geometry here, you'll discover that the market only can support an average price of 3.6 million. Well, that means that this projected price here is quite a bit higher than what the market will support. In fact, so much so, you see that these points are very closely tied to the curve. And by my calculation, this point is 268 standard deviations over this point right here, which means that the chance of them, the government, getting 100 or more AGM 183s is very much less than 1 in a trillion. It'd be much like seeing the next person walking through your door would be a man that would have a height of 72.8 feet. It's not going to happen. And we need to know that when we start to push ideas forward, that certain things there's not enough money in the world to support it. Conversely, new bombers also abide by demand frontiers. And so what we're seeing here is we have the 2021 frontier marked in red. And then many of the same vehicles here formed the 1996 frontier with their quantities shifted a bit here in gray. And you see that this frontier has moved only 2%. 2% in 25 years. So the B2 ran afoul of this. The B2 wanted to buy originally 132 vehicles. That was far above this frontier, and they eventually settled for 21, which helped form this frontier. And you might have said to yourself, well, how can we know this? It's an extrapolation. Well, lots of life is an extrapolation, but you can see here we had over 2.5 orders of magnitude, or 2 orders of magnitude here of data that suggested that we were going to be able to extend this curve. After we built the B1, if you extended the curve, the B2 ended up exactly where you might have predicted. Now, what's going to happen to the B21? Well, the B21 is facing the same issues. It too has to abide by this demand frontier, and they've got a target. They want to buy 100 or maybe as many as 200 of these vehicles. And you see at 200, they're way out of bed. At 100, they're not as far out of bed. But they have a limit here. And it looks like they might be able to get double what the B2 did, but still not the 100 that they want. And so what this means is you can only get a very few squadrons at these very high prices. And so what you should be doing instead is dampening the price down so you can get more squadrons and push those squadrons to their forward bases so they can do the mission that you want them to do. So what I've shown you so far is a very detailed dive into a process, and that process is the law of value and demand. The law of value and demand. It's different than the law of supply and demand. This is a process that we've discovered through analytics, and it doesn't have too much in the way of text to it. It basically says that the features of a product determine its value. The value eventually determines the price. Somebody could price it too high or too low, but value will eventually determine the price. Price, in turn, determines the quantity sold. And as we saw with the B2, quantity sold is one of the features that the market entertains. And so there's some sub-elements that come out of this that we want to take a look at. Now, what we usually try to do first is it works out that studying the quantity and the prices is often the easiest thing to do. So demand analyses study quantities and prices, and they look at demand frontiers, as we've seen, and aggregate market demand. And then another concept called average demand, product demand that you saw. Then we might have sub-market demand and sub-market demand. So, for example, in helicopters, you've got the market for all helicopters. Then you might have the market for Western-built helicopters, would be a sub-market. And then the sub-market might be the various missions that the helicopters fly. So there's search and rescue, and then there's emergency medical services, and then there's offshore platforms, and then there's military missions. So it's the easiest studied parameters. However, importantly, sometimes some markets try to hide their sales figures. Getting back to helicopters, a lot of those sales figures are hidden on purpose by the manufacturer. Now, the features of a market determine of a product determine the value. So, who does that? Well, you and I do that. Anybody that buys something determines the features they like, and they basically vote with their wallet. So in general, people like things like capacity. So in a bomber, it would be payload. In your computer, it might be storage. You like speed. Again, the same kind of things here. In your computer, you want speed and you want storage. And people like comfort. So when they're looking for say a business jet, they want to have the most amount of space that they can have. Or in train travel, people are paying more for the higher class products than the lower class products because they're more comfortable. And we're going to look at that in a little bit. There's other things. Basically, whatever the buyers say is important to them is important to them. And very often the key features aren't obvious, so you have to do a lot of digging. And that turns out to be part of the process here. And when things are out of bed, just to say if products are undervalued, that means that they're below what the market value is for them. And that means that if you're a buyer, you might want to buy that product because it's actually worth this amount and it's being offered to you for this amount. Conversely, you have some products that may be overvalued. It's worth this, but they're charging this, and you can kind of use this analysis to bring them down to the target price that you want to have. So how do we use this stuff? Well, let's take a look. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the process here and some sample applications. So let's start with an analysis you could do in a weekend, which is what I did here. 10 years ago, I decided to study the ground beef market. So suppose you wanted to study that, and you say, well, with a little bit of effort, you could put together a database of wholesale and retail pricing. So I went out, got wholesale pricing from this source here. And so what we're looking at is the price per pound and the leanness and the package size, price per pound, leanness, and package size. And so at the wholesale level, all the packages are 100 pounds, and they had this varying leanness that they have. And then in the supermarkets, you won't find any stuff that's 50% lean in the supermarket. At least I didn't. But you'll find varying sizes of packages and leanness and varying prices per pound. Well, what can you do with that, you might ask? Well, let's take a look. Let's do a dot plot in 3D space and look at the market in January 2012. And so here's package size on this axis right here. Here's leanness on this axis right here. Here's price per pound on this axis here. And so these are all the packages that I discovered at my local Walmart that are all 5 pounds or less down here. And these are the 100-pound packages that came from the wholesaler here. So you could run this through a regression tool and then take that regression and run a plot of it. You get a value surface. And if you were to do that, as I did, you get a value surface that would look something like this. This one's shown in orange here. And what did we just say? We said, well, products that are below their predicted price are undervalued. So we look at this guy here and you say, all the other wholesale prices seem to follow this line pretty much, but this is below that surface. In fact, it's 34 cents a pound too low. And what this means, if you're the wholesaler, is over that period in which they sold it, they were selling 290 million pounds at that price. And that's $100 million error that you could find in, I found it a weekend. So this turns out to be pretty useful stuff. Now, if you're buying food for your cafeteria, you can use this kind of analysis right here. And if you find something that's undervalued, say you're buying this product before and this product before and making this product, you could just say, hey, I can buy this product and I can save money. So this is one of the ways in which you can use this. Now, demand analysis over time reveals what we call market momentum, and it shows the limits there. So in the business aircraft market, ladies and gentlemen, there's this company called Aerion that formed in the early 2000s, and then they reformed and decided to make something called the AS2, which is a supersonic business jet. And they got their first orders for it in November of 2015. Now, they wanted to sell this business jet at $120 million. And if you were to do the value analysis of it, as I did, you'd say, hey, it's worth every nickel. But you might say you may want to take notice of this upper demand frontier that formed in the market here over this 10-year period, because Ariane said they wanted to sell 300 in 10 years. Well, they started out with 20. So, okay, that's the first order. We can accept that. And the market at this point in time, it looks like its limit was 47. Now, of course, some units are higher than that and others are lower. They're forming this frontier. That's how frontiers work. But if you're to be squarely on the line, it would be 47. Now, I've been noticing this device for some time and discovered that 5 years later, well, they still only had 20 orders. Now, the upper demand frontier had shifted a bit in their favor. It went from supporting 47 at the midpoint here to 63, but they still were far short of their goal of 300. And what also happened in the market here, very importantly, is there was an outer demand frontier that formed. Upper demand frontiers look at the limits the market has with respect to price, while outer demand frontiers look at the limits the market has with respect to saturation or fulfillment. So at this point, the market has absorbed all it can absorb, and there's a limit to how much it'll take right here. And we're going to look at this in a little more detail later. So I saw this, and I did the analytics, figured out what the chances of this happening were. It wasn't less than 1 in a trillion for the B, as it was for the B-21. But I did discover it was about 1 in 40 chance. So I wrote in December of 2020 that the Ariane kids had a very slim chance to sell the 300 units that they wanted to in 10 years. In fact, another way you could get to it is you could look at how many units were sold by price over 10 years. And it turns out the market only supported 55 units greater than 80 million in the previous 10 years. And they wanted to sell 300 at 50% more. It's not going to happen. So I wrote that little note to them, and then they had a VP there who saw the post, and he gave me a very angry reply saying that they had just made a huge sale and they were on track. And I said, good for you. You still won't make your target. Good luck. And 6 months later, they went into receivership. And they're not writing me anymore. Now, all this could have been prevented. And what is this? This is $1 billion plus loss, ladies and gentlemen. All that could have been avoided had the analysis been done in advance. So another title I had here was How to Lose $1 Billion, and some of the follow-up posts on this particular product here. Now, many of you are in the government sector, and you might want to say, well, how can this help me in the public sector here? So out here in California, I'm in Southern California, just north of Los Angeles. We're trying to build a high-speed rail system that wants to go from San Francisco to LA and then eventually have these other legs to it. And in 2015, they calculated the average price for the ticket at $86. Now, this railroad, as you can imagine, or if you've been following it, the cost of it has, as so many of them do, the cost has gone up over time. But you might want to ask yourself, is this price valid? Was that price valid when it was posted in 2015? Well, what do other railroads fetch? Well, let's take a look. We don't have too many high-speed rail outfits in the United States. There's only 1 or 2, I think. But the Japanese have a bullet train, several bullet trains that have 4 classes. In fact, if you look at the movie Bullet Train, you watch Brad Pitt, he actually runs these different classes here if you're interested. Actually validated my pictures of this. So this is their economy class. This is one step up. This is another step up and another step up. So as you move up, you go from 6 across to 5 across to 4 across to 3 across, and you're getting progressively more seat area. And so you say to yourself, well, what are you buying when you're buying a bullet train ride? Well, let's figure that out. What we did was we looked at all the data for which we had retrieved the distance and the seat area and the speed, net speed of all these trains that they had running. And then we put it into a regression tool and regressed it. And we discovered that the equation that described the value of a train ticket in Japan in this time frame, 2012, was this constant times the number of miles raised to this power times the seat area raised to this power times the speed raised to that power. If you then take the potential seat areas and just calculate it here for this train here, knowing that we wanted to go from here to here, so the distance is known, they gave a certain time, which gives you a net speed, you can find out that the prices for the train ticket, if it were a Japanese train, would be this, which means that the train looks to be about 2x off what the Japanese had. And you say, well, Doug, why would that be useful? Well, it turns out that the prices for train travel from Japan to Europe are relatively the same. So what we've done here is we've plotted the demand for this Tokyo line in late 2011. So we've had this point, and this point here, to which we've added the Eurostar London to Paris route here. And it turns out that when you put all these points together on a chart, they all end up being on the same demand curve. And so you say to yourself, it's probably the case that there's a like value response surface. It may have a different constant, may have different coefficients, but there's probably a like curve for value and there's a like curve for demand. And if you're trying to figure out the value and cost of a public service, you probably ought to figure that out before you start making the service. Now, there are many ways that the demand for a product can end. So we have talked a lot about what we call upper demand frontiers. And so these upper demand frontiers represent the price limits. And this outer demand frontier depicts the saturation limits. And so in this period here, we discovered the PC12 was lying outside of the frontier. In fact, it was actually the point that was furthest to the right of the outer demand frontier, again, the saturation limit. And it turns out that this vehicle is actually worth more than its price. So they've actually dropped the price to sell more. And you can do that to a point, but at a certain point, and that point was hit right here, it attains a saturation limit. The market simply won't put any more money into that market for that product or any other like product here. So this forms that limit. Now, it also turns out that product demand curves, as we're going to see here, product demand curves and the related upper demand frontiers may eventually intersect. So there's an overall demand frontier for cars. This is for the 1981 car market worldwide. And there was a demand frontier here. And it worked out that if you got the number of vehicles, you took their horsepower and their number of seats and the quantity sold, you could work out a product demand curve here. So 911C helped form the demand frontier, and so did the BMW 528i. And what you're discovering here then is that, products can occasionally exceed the frontier. I mean, you've got, in order to form a curve, you got items above, on, and below the curve. And so you're going to always have some products that are above the curve, but you're not going to exceed it by much. And in this particular market, these particular curves form annually. Every year you'll see a curve like this. And then learning curves and their product demand curves may eventually intersect one another. So the good people at Ford Motor Company, back in the early 1900s, over 100 years ago, started tracking the cost of their Model T, shown in blue here. This is in millions. This is the price in $1993. So this is $1 million here, $10 million here. It's $10,000 in $1993. And they tracked the price of their vehicle over time. And eventually, this blue point came to overlap the orange point here. And so just as we saw with the B2, well, the Ford Model T had the production line stopped when the cost met or exceeded the value of the product. So for the B2, it stopped at 21 units. The Model T stopped at 15 million units. So I maintain for this organization, for DHS, and for everybody that's listening, that complete estimating analyses are going to have to address the cost, schedule, and risk topics that you've always been looking at, but you also need to add in value, demand, and profitability for commercial programs or force needs for the USG. That's a theme that we want to take out of this. So how might these principles apply to the government with respect to taxation? Well, in 2014, Colorado and Washington State both legalized recreational marijuana. Now, Colorado's got this population, and they applied this tax rate in that year. At the end of the year, they had $375 million in tax revenues from marijuana, money that they wouldn't have had otherwise. I mean, this is brand new money to them. They would have not had that had they not worked out a way to legalize that. Now, the good state of Washington, well, that's got about a third more people. And this is not a typo, ladies and gentlemen. They had a tax rate of, over 100% when they first initiated this legal recreational marijuana. And at the end of the year, their revenue was about a seventh of what Colorado's was. Well, you might ask yourselves, why was that? Well, let's look. Let's see what people have had to say about taxation and see what we can do to try to model that. And so it works out that Arthur Laffer, who is still with us, Arthur Laffer famously came up with the self-named Laffer curve. And what he was trying to show here was, I think it was originally President Reagan, that if you set the tax rate to 100%, you're going to get no tax revenue. If you set it to 0%, you get no tax revenue. But somewhere in between, you can get maximum tax. If that's your goal, you can get a maximum tax somewhere between 0 and 100%. Well, let's take a look at the recreational marijuana tax rates and the revenue per capita over a period of time here. So these are individual year per capita revenue retrievals for Washington State. And so here's Washington State in 2014, Washington State in 2019. Here's California in 19, Oregon in 19, Colorado in 14. Again, this is per capita, and Nevada was way up here. And it appears that there's a marijuana Laffer curve at the frontier that describes the market here. And very interestingly, as Washington State decided finally to reduce their tax rates, well, by golly, the revenue soared. As they dropped the rate, people bought more of the recreational marijuana there. Now, this is important information if you're doing regular taxation. There's another Laffer curve that exists for all the United States when it comes to the IRS trying to retrieve money from its citizens. And if you take enough data, you can form curves exactly like this for income tax or any other tax that you care to look at. So how do these principles apply to currency? I think most of you know now that we're in the middle of a inflationary period. Inflation is pretty high. So just prior to COVID breaking out in February 2020, using dot plots of fiat currency, which we're going to see here, we discovered we could predict any country's price of their currency relative to dollars as a function of the foreign exchange reserves that it had, the amount of currency it had in circulation, and the prime rate in the country. So what does that mean visually? Let's take a look. These are the same sets of dots, and we're varying one variable here. We're varying prime rate in both of these cases. So what we're looking at again, ladies and gentlemen, is we've got foreign exchange reserves here. So each one of these dots represents the foreign exchange reserves of these fiat currencies. And here's the volume that they have of the currency. And then this surface here represents what the value of the currency would be if the prime rate were 2%. And in fact, back then in the United States in February 2020, this was pretty close to our prime rate. So you get a surface that's up here. Now, if your prime rate happened to climb to 63%, the value of your currency falls naturally enough. And this mimics what the prime rate was for Brazil in that time frame. And so using these kind of analyses, you can help the Federal Reserve or whomever else that you want to help out figure out how to maintain the price of a currency. That turns out to be pretty useful stuff. Oh, in some, and again, we're going to have some questions after this. In some, we've discovered that the markets, all markets, demonstrate opposing forces. They have value and costs go up as you add features. So if you make a bigger ship, it's got more hull volume, it's got more horsepower, but it's also got more value. It goes faster, it carries more people. So value and cost go up as you add desired features or if you remove undesirable features. As quantities increase, prices will fall and costs will fall too. So prices are falling because the market's getting saturated. Costs fall because people get smarter, and we need to figure out how those two slopes relate to one another. Forces here seem to be ubiquitous. We've applied them to many markets, as you've seen, and we've shown that works for everything from ground beef, as you saw, to train travel, to spaceships. And so the government will always have the minimum requirements, which we're going to address presently, and some budget limits that we're going to see. We're going to address that too. We've addressed that already. And what we're maintaining here is that working across these multiple dimensions, again, these are market dimensions. No physics has been invented here. We're just discovering how the markets work. Working across these multiple dimensions enhances our vision. With the help of the DHS, we took some questions in from the employees, and so we're going to answer these questions in turn here. So how might we deploy these analyses before we start something? What if we already have a product or a service going on right now? How do we do analysis then? What do we do? Importantly, from the government standpoint or commercial standpoint, depending on which sector you're in, how do these analyses differ? What are some unexpected revelations that came from this? A couple of shots at that. And then finally, what is a big example of the analysis? So we're going to answer all these questions here in turn. So pre-launch, how do we do these analyses before we launch a program? So the Airbus people in Europe in 2000 had a 20-year forecast of 1,250 units. If you wanted to check that out, you can find it here. They said we're going to sell 1,250 of these units. Now, the way Airbus justified this, as many commercial entities do, is they just basically did some analyses on cost per seat mile, what people are paying for seats now, what they would be paying in the future, try to figure out what the added value of that would be. And then that became, along with polling customers, they would say, how many do you want to buy? They would ask all the various customers. They'd come up with a total, and they decrement that between their buildup of the services and their breakdown of the customers. They come up with some sort of blended number in the middle, and that was their market analysis, all of which takes years. But suppose you had a weekend. What would you do in a weekend? Well, what did I do in a weekend? Well, what I did for a weekend just a couple of weeks ago is I went out and retrieved the prices and costs of all models of 737 in this 20-year time frame. So this is that they're projecting ahead 20 years in 2000. Here I'm taking the 20 trailing years for the market here. So we've taken all the 737s and worked out an average price, and we've come up with the 767s and 747s, and then these other wide-body airliners. There's some other jets in here. These are all the airliners we could find. Somewhere here, less than 100. Again, notice the time frame. There's an L1011 in here. And what you would discover, what I discovered, is if you did that analysis. Now, this curve is not as well correlated as many that we've had here, ladies and gentlemen. It's not got a poor correlation, but the p-value, the probability that it came about due to chance, is less than 5%. So that's a threshold for a lot of us. And what this is suggesting, again, in a weekend's analysis, is that the chance that you can sell 1,250 is about almost 10 standard deviations above the curve here. And in fact, even selling the 251 they eventually did sell, that was above the curve. And the way they got to that is, as many suspected in the United States, and I suspected too, well, the Europeans were simply subsidizing that. And that maybe sounds like a great idea until you realize that that money came out of the taxpayers' pockets. So Airbus used polls. They basically said, well, what would you buy? They're asking people what they would do, and they're taking the words of the buyers. But demand studies such as this look at the actions. And I submit, and the market's submitting here too, that the actions are more predictable and useful than the words of the customer. So the actions are this, and the words were that, and those two things didn't match up. And in the end, oh my golly, it cost the taxpayers maybe 30 billion euros, according to this little deployment here. That link right there, excuse me. So how do we deploy these analyses when something's in service? Well, my wife and I, maybe you and your significant other, you go out to, we go out to dinner once in a while. We have a favorite place. Maybe you do too. And so just as COVID was starting to ramp up and we had to all eat outside, my wife and I went to our favorite restaurant and we discovered we had to wait. Now, we almost always get a seat at this place, and now we're limited to sitting outside, as everybody was. And this is the configuration that we saw the restaurant in. Now, I suggested to the manager, who is a good friend of ours, I suggested to her that layout is not optimal. Well, what would you do instead? I suggested reconfiguring the seats to get many more tables of two, and they put the tables in this way. So what was the result of that? Well, in May of 2020, they made that amount. But by July, they made this amount. Now, why is that? Well, I happen to know just from observation, this restaurant had more parties of two than parties of four. And if you turn out and do just a little bit of research, you can find this from a restaurant site here. It turns out that there are over twice as many parties of two versus parties of four. And knowing that allows you to reallocate the resources in a way in which it makes sense. And so the government faces many questions about resource allocation all the time. And analyses like this reveal what is possible and what can become optimal if we take the time to do that. So now, how do commercial and USG analyses differ? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to suggest to you that both the government and commercial entities face something called financial CAT scanning, which we're going to look at right now. So how do you do a financial CAT scan? Well, you might guess that we like to plot points in this discipline. We're going to plot now the demand points. Now, these are the demand points. These were real demand points for a market for general aviation aircraft way over 10 years ago. And so these were quantities of 300 going this way, and these were increments of 500,000 going this way. So we've plotted the demand points. And the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to bin the data and sum the data. So what we've done here again is we've added up all the quantities in a bin, taken the total revenue and divided the total revenue by the total quantity to get a total quantity and average price point here, 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 and here. And then we want to run a regression through that to come up with an aggregate demand curve for the market. And then, as you've seen before, we want to find the frontier. And the frontier here is very well defined. It's got all these points here. Now, you might say to yourself, what are we going to do with this? Well, if you're a commercial entity or if you're the government, you might say, well, what is it that what space is uncovered in this market? And by space, I can say there would be a spaces relative to the features that the products have, or in this case, the prices that the markets are displaying. So you see here, we've got a lot of competition up to this point here and a lot of competition north of here, but there's a little gap that forms between here and here. So we might say, well, let's find a gap and target that. So now we've solved for a target price. Now, as we've done this, observe, ladies and gentlemen, we've already solved for the theoretical max quantity. As we discovered the price, we've set our max quantity. This is something the B2 kids could have done and the B21 kids should have done, not doing. As you set a price, you're actually setting a quantity limit for yourself, whether or not you know it. Now, as we've seen, there's a value space that relates to this, where we're going to get a certain amount of feature A and a certain amount of feature B. And our job then would be to say, well, this is a point of 0, 0, 0, 0. We don't want 0 of anything. So we're going to try to create a target area so we get a certain amount of feature A and a certain amount of feature B. But we can't have limited amounts of feature A and feature B. So we're going to have a targeted area here. And then without showing the points to go along with this, we say to ourselves, well, let's add the value and cost. Now, we've already shown you how to do value with the dot plots, and we've got this creates the value surface that the points have been removed. And you can imagine there's a cost for 1 here as shown, and then there's a cost for 500 as shown. And so now you say to yourself, wow, that's pretty cool. And then you say, well, maybe we want to reconsider the constraints and say, which are shown by these orange surfaces here. You say, with respect to feature A, I'm going to abide by the maximum that I set for myself, but instead of creating this minimum here, I want the minimum to go from here to here. And I'm going to have this limit here. Then the feature B direction, I said, well, I'm going to abide by my original minimum here as defined by this surface, but I'm not going to abide by the previous maximum. I'm going to pull it in a bit and constrain it here. So now you've got this volume that's described by these constraints on the front and the back, and by the top by this target price that you've set for yourself, or the value surface, and by the bottom with the cost for 1 or the cost for 500. And so this is a volume not unlike your head. And so if you were to go to your ear, nose, and throat doctor and say, I can't breathe, your doctor might say to yourself, I think we ought to do a CAT scan of your head. What do you think? And you might say, I think that's a great idea. Well, it turns out that what your doctor's doing when he's doing a CAT scan is he's doing digital section cuts of the volume that is your head to see what's going on. Well, we can do the same thing in financial spaces. So we can do section cuts or financial CAT scans through this volume here. And we're going to run them here, in this case, through the feature B dimension. Then we're going to flip it over and go to feature A. We're not going to do the vertical CAT scanning, although, of course, you see that we could do that. And so what comes out of this? Well, what's happened here is that companies should sell for profit. So this green line here, this is the value surface that we've discovered for ourselves. This blue line here is the cost for 1 that we came up with. This darker blue line is the cost for 500. And where value meets the price target, we've actually got this profit line. This the distance between this. Here's the profit for 1, and here's the per unit profit for 500. Now, what we've done in the process then is we've solved for feature A, and we've solved for feature B. Now, companies sell for profit. What does the government need to sell for? Well, certainly the government needs to figure out what their minimum quantities are. So when the government set that price, effectively set the minimum quantity for themselves. Again, when they set a price, you are setting the minimum quantity for yourself. Now, and So the price and the quantity are intertwined. But also, very critically, what the government needs to be able to do is you need to define the needs that you have for feature A. In this case, what we've done by doing the section cut, we've come over here and we solve for feature A. And we solve for feature B. So using this analysis, what we've done, if you're a commercial entity, we've taken a four-dimensional system. We got rid of the quantity component to it by setting the price. That got rid of the quantity element. We came up with a 3D value space. We took 2D section cuts of the value space and came up with a one-dimensional profit answer. So we went from 4 dimensions to 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions to 1 dimension. And the government, I maintain and submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, is the government needs to be doing the same thing to figure out what it can get for each of features A and B relative to this type of analysis. So we've solved here for quantity, price, feature A, feature B, cost of 1, cost of 500, and the value for this, and the profit for the government, or I should say the profit for the companies. This is something I think we ought to put into standard practice. So what unexpected revelations have I seen from the analysis? Well, some friends of mine are very health conscious, and they said, Doug, what can you tell us about COVID using this kind of analysis? And I said to him, I don't know. Let's take a look. So COVID isn't trying to make a buck. COVID's objective function, I submit, is to increase the number of cases that it has, is to spread its DNA out into the world. So on a value basis, they're trying to get cases, and the cost, there's a biological cost of the virus to do that. And so what we see here, we've got cases as the vertical axis, and then there's the way in which it gets to the population. So it has to be mobile. It has to have a certain motility to it. And I submit at the beginning, the GDP per capita was part of the motility, which is to say that the higher the GDP, and GDP is going this way, the higher the GDP, the more cases that were discovered, which means that as people have more money to travel, they enable the motility of the COVID virus. And of course, as this is germ density here, so you see it's easier to see it this way, as the population increases, so too did the number of cases. And that's because the germ density went hand in hand with the density of the targets. Now, over on the other side, what had been a demand function now becomes a boundary function. So you've got the certain number of potential means. So again, these are the ways in which COVID makes its way into people. These are the means that it has to do it in humans. There's only so many humans. And we have this little interesting way of plotting, and we can plot them by country. And it worked out in April of 2020, which is when this analysis was, that if you take this upper limit here, well, all of these countries were relatively more wealthy than the median wealth of average countries in the world. And you notice, with the exception of Qatar, all these countries are in the northern climes, and so they may have vitamin D deficiency. And you notice here's the lower boundary. China claimed it was on the lower boundary, but we may suspect it's data. But you notice every other country on this boundary is in the equatorial zone. And so you might guess, just looking at this, that, hey, 3 months into COVID being a big thing in the United States, it looks like, let's take a look at vitamin D. Vitamin D looks like, the sunshine looks like there's something to this. Now, you can imagine, too, that if you were to change the objective function to say something like watts, if you were to follow the Tour de France, you might discover that some people, if this were watts in this direction and this were duration of time that you can generate watts, there are some very high caliber athletes that can put out over 1,500 watts or 2 horsepower for 20 seconds or more. And then as you go out into, you take seconds, go to minutes, go to hours, a lot of those same athletes can hold 200 watts for 5 or 6 hours. And so there's a demand curve that will appear for watts. And then you can imagine that there's a certain value response in the body to generating the watts. Say, for example, power to weight ratios or red blood cell count, hematocrit, and which would increase it. Power to weight would increase it, but then maybe lactose buildup in the muscles might drop it. What else have we seen that's been unexpected? Well, it turns out that penguins huddle for warmth. And in fact, some scientists did some very interesting studies here. These penguins not only huddle for warmth, they actually cycle through. And it looks like the penguins are solving, not using little calculators or anything like that or doing it in their heads, but they're actually doing little differential equations as they move from the inside of the pack to the outside of the pack. And so they go to the inside of the pack, as you might imagine, to become warm. Then they go to the outside of the pack to make the rest of the rest of the huddle warm. So penguins huddle for warmth. Well, what do we do as humans? Well, the football players, they huddle for information, for data, for plans. And it turns out if you look at the stock market, this is the S&P 500 from a few years ago. Well, there's a huddle here too. This is the shares traded in the price. So you see this formation doesn't look too much different than this formation right here. And also, if you turn out, this is of course, by now we know this is a demand analysis. So let's take a look at this in the 3D space. So birds flock for safety. This is a sort sol in Europe at a certain day. The starlings flock like this. Fighter planes do the same thing. Safety in numbers. Don't be a straggler. And it turns out that the stock market does the same thing. The stock market flocks to features. So in this case, again, this is price in this direction. This is the earnings per share. And this is the book value. And there's a flocking tendency that happens here that doesn't look dissimilar from this flocking tendency here. And then finally, what's the big example of this analysis? Well, as of yesterday, we would put together a fund just based on it's real money in it. It's not a hypothetical. And we've put this real money in, and we're comparing ourselves to these indices in Berkshire Hathaway. And it turns out that we've managed to beat these analyses over the past 2.5 years. So that's a pretty big thing for us. And I think it's just another example of how this analysis validates itself in the real world. So, ladies and gentlemen, I got to thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Again, my name is Doug Howarth. If you care to contact me, you can either swipe this code here or email me at either one of these two email addresses or give me a call on that phone number. Again, I'd like to thank Jonathan and Carrie and everybody else that got me into this conference. And with that, I would like to sign off. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Doug, for what I would call an excellent presentation. And thank you for working with me to come up with some questions that I'm sure our audience was thinking during the presentation and then providing the answers to those questions. That brings us to the end of this on-demand session. Thank you, and we will see you in the next presentation.